Okay, it is 11:03, so we're going to get started. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the overview of VT7, Verra's new tool for unplanned deforestation allocation. My name is Andrew Copenhaver, and I am a Forest Carbon Data Innovation Manager here at Verra. I'm responsible for a good bit of the geospatial work being done in Verra's forest carbon work streams, and I was responsible for some of the last mile work with getting VT7 released. I'd like to go through the of the webinar. My hope is that when you leave this webinar, you will know enough about VT7 to email me some really difficult questions and help us identify opportunities for future enhancements. Today, we will be discussing the tool at a high level. And while this is a technical overview, it is being presented for a general audience. So this means that I will be making some simplifications where appropriate to aid in driving general understanding. The presentation is not intended to create any ambiguity. For the most thorough and precise language, please rely on VT7 documentation itself. The documentation includes some helpful examples and demonstratives, many of which are also included in this presentation. Additionally, we will be talking about some of the requirements for VT7 and how that impacted development of the tool. We will be going through who does what in the context of VT7, who makes the benchmark risk maps, who tests alternatives, and how they are used by project proponents. And finally, we'll briefly discuss where we're at with some of Verra's risk mapping initiatives and next steps for VT7 and jurisdictional risk mapping more generally. One final caveat for this presentation, and I will be making a few similar caveats throughout. While this tool is applicable for both JNR and Verra's consolidated RED methodology, VM0048, the primary focus of this presentation will be on the applicability within VM0048's unplanned deforestation module, VMD55. We do not intend for this presentation to take the full hour, and we will be reserving some time at the end to go through and hopefully answer some questions live. We will briefly go through some of the background and context of VT7 before we move on to the technical overview of the benchmark risk map development process, how alternative maps are to be developed, and finally, how jurisdictional risk maps are selected for use. We will then briefly go through the VMD55 accounting process and who does what in that process, and we'll wrap up with next steps and questions. One final bit of housekeeping before we get kicked off in earnest. Verra will be posting this webinar and the accompanying slides to our website. Registered participants will also receive a follow-up email that includes a link to the recording. If previous webinars are any indication of this one, we are expecting quite a few questions. I'm going to say this up front to set expectations, but this presentation is fairly limited in scope and is concerned largely with the nuts and bolts of VT7. As much as I'd love to answer all of your questions, I am at my core a simple data scientist who, while happy to be here with all of you, would just as soon get back to his Jupyter notebook. So if your questions are not relevant to VT7, I ask that you write them up and email them to the relevant team at Verra. Please send questions about existing projects to secretariat@verra.org. And for general inquiries, please reach out to info@verra.org. For questions related to forest carbon and RED, please reach out to forestcarbon@verra.org. Additionally, if possible, and if we don't have time to get through all the questions, we will try to go through your questions after this presentation and respond to you in the form of an email. We are probably going to be getting a lot of questions, and there aren't all that many of us available to answer them outside of me. So I will do what I can at the end of the presentation. So how did we get here? Why did we get here? And what does it matter? As many of you are likely aware, the road to release for VT7 was a somewhat long and winding process involving many dedicated individuals, teams, and organizations. Development on precursors to this tool started almost 4 years ago by some of our colleagues at Carbon Decisions International, which ultimately led to the draft release of the JNR risk mapping tool and the spreadsheet-based JNR allocation tool. Over the course of about the last year and a half, our partners at Clark Labs, Clark University, and TerraCarbon have taken on the mantle of adapting and modifying some of that previous work into a GIS-based unified risk mapping and allocation tool with an accompanying Python-based implementation, complete with a simple-to-use graphical user interface. On the Verra side, I'd like to just call out the work of Salvador Sanchez Colon, our RED Technical Innovation Manager, who oversaw a good bit of that recent development and that collaboration with Clark Labs. And we wouldn't be speaking now if not for his efforts. I got to come in at the end and put a bow on much of the excellent work already done by a multitude of people that preceded me. When developing the tool, VT7, we operated under a few organizing principles, focusing on fairness, conservativeness, parsimony, and simplicity. We also tacitly prioritized and will continue to prioritize transparency, explainability, and continuous improvement. I should note that many of these design objectives on this slide are most directly relevant to the benchmark mapping approach, which we'll soon go through in detail. Thus, our first key design objective is that the approach should minimize opportunities for biased allocations. We want to make sure that we avoid situations where allocations might be distorted to favor or disadvantage particular projects via either the approach itself or the underlying data. Second, we wanted the approach to be able to identify areas of extreme low risk of deforestation to make sure that such areas receive minimal activity data allocations and do not lead to inflated baselines. Third, we wanted our approach to have minimal data requirements. We're well aware that RED projects are often located in data-constrained environments, and we do not want to base our benchmark approach to rely on any data that isn't already available or can't easily be made available. Our current approach uses only a single remote sensing derived variable for risk mapping. Finally, we wanted our approach to be simple and to minimize opportunities for mistakes in application, but also to remain effective. Some of the early drafts of the tool required manual inputs and were computationally intensive. As stated previously, the most recent version of the GIS-based tool the most recent version of the tool is GIS-based. And outside of the data inputs required, very few parameters are required to be manually set, the tool doing most of the work in the background. With that being said, it would be arrogant to suggest that the tool as is perfect, and we've placed a premium on transparency. We value your feedback, and given that VT7 is something of a departure from previous Verra tools, continuous improvement is imperative. As a firm believer in free and open source software, I am proud that our Python code is open source, and we've already received lots of helpful feedback for potential opportunities for enhancement to the code itself, as well as to the underlying approach. Additionally, we've included implementation examples within the VT7 document itself, which we hope will help stakeholders more easily grasp the details and make helpful suggestions. How does all of this relate to VM0048 and VMD55? As you're hopefully aware, Verra has undertaken a massive effort to collect activity data estimates for over 50 countries and almost twice as many jurisdictions when considering subnational jurisdictional programs. This activity data is derived by sampling and visually interpreting sample plots to derive the change category of that plot, such as forest loss, regrowth, stable forest, stable non-forest, over the course of the 10-year historical reference period. This activity data is used to develop figures of deforestation during the historical reference period at a jurisdictional scale, which are used to predict deforestation rates during the 6-year baseline validity period following the historical reference period. VT7 is used to localize or to allocate those jurisdictional deforestation figures across the jurisdiction, proportionally allocating the amount of jurisdictional deforestation based on the local deforestation risk. This is to say that areas at higher risk of deforestation will be allocated larger proportions of the jurisdictional activity data. VT7 creates a raster grid of deforestation risk, where each pixel represents the expected amount of deforestation for a given time period. The deforestation risk is used in conjunction with forest strata maps developed by a project proponent to estimate emissions from carbon stock changes based upon the amount of estimated deforestation within each forest strata. And I want to be extra clear on this, and I'll be saying this at a few other points in the presentation, but Verra and its DSPs are responsible for developing these risk maps, and the risk maps used for allocation of the activity data. There is no expectation that project proponents will need to develop risk maps or to use VT7 much at all. This tool was developed for use by Verra and its contractors. However, we do welcome you to try it out, use it for your own purposes, use it for due diligence, use it because you're curious, and to, again, give us any relevant feedback that you feel would be useful for us to have. Okay, now that we have some of the background out of the way, let's move on to the meat of the presentation. In our technical overview, we'll begin by going through a few important definitions. Within VT7, there are quite a few very related terms, and I myself have been known to conflate them, and apologies in advance if I conflate them on this call. Then we'll briefly go over the applicability conditions of the tool. Next, we'll discuss minimum data requirements and the development sequence for the risk maps. We'll then discuss developing benchmark maps and their purpose before moving on to alternative maps and wrapping up the technical overview by discussing the selection procedure for choosing our final jurisdictional risk map of allocated deforestation. All right, does that sound good? And yeah, I only have a few more text-heavy slides, I promise, and then it will be all maps and plots and fun stuff. So, I'm assuming everybody on the call can read, so I won't go word for word through these definitions for VT7, but I will highlight a few key terms and distinctions. Additionally, all the definitions located on this slide are also the same as within the VT7 documentation itself. We also have some of the acronyms that we use listed out in there, and I will try to explain the acronyms before I use them, but if anything sounds unfamiliar, please refer to the VT7 documentation. First and foremost, I'd like to distinguish how we've chosen to define a few of these seemingly interchangeable terms. So for the purposes of VT7, deforestation risk and deforestation vulnerability have different meanings. Deforestation risk means and refers to the probability of deforestation, i.e., there's a 50% chance that a given pixel will be deforested during the baseline validity period. Deforestation vulnerability is somewhat of a simplification of that, where susceptibility to deforestation is expressed in terms of ordinal categories. So lower categories correspond to lower relative susceptibility, and higher categories correspond to higher relative risk of susceptibility. For VT7, we default to 30 distinct risk categories. The negligible risk threshold is a term related to our benchmark mapping approach, where the risk of deforestation is expected to be extremely low based on the distance of a given location to forest edge. So it really is just the threshold beneath which 99.5% of deforestation occurred during the historical reference period. And it's not anything that any of our users will directly need to calculate. It is calculated within our Python tool. Allocated risk is slightly different than just risk, and allocated risk takes the deforestation risk and expresses it as the per pixel amount of estimated deforestation in hectares per pixel, based on the amount of deforestation estimated from the activity data sampling during the historical reference period. So if you sum the pixels of the allocated risk map, they will not exceed the total deforestation amount or defined period as determined by the AD sampling. Finally, For VT7, modeling regions simply refer to the zones we use to calculate the relative frequency of deforestation. They're an intersection of the administrative region, one level below the jurisdiction. So if your jurisdiction is a country, that would correspond to a state. If your jurisdiction is a state, it might correspond to something like a municipality. But they are the intersection of administrative regions, one level below the jurisdiction, and the map of deforestation vulnerability classes, again, ranging from 0 to 30. So I'm just going to read directly from this slide here, but VT7 is applicable under either of the following conditions. The project is a standalone project meeting the applicability conditions for projects that aim to avoid unplanned deforestation as defined in VMD55 and is seeking allocation of jurisdictional unplanned deforestation activity data, or a higher level jurisdiction is seeking to allocate their FREL to projects or lower level jurisdictions aiming to avoid unplanned deforestation. Again, as I said at the start of the call, the focus of this presentation is largely within the context of VMD 55. So we will be primarily focused on applicability condition 1. Okay, we are now out of the text-heavy portion of the presentation, and I promise there will only be a few more slides that even have text on them. So one caveat to all of these graphics I want to get out of the way is that the graphics in this slide and the map data in this slide does not represent the actual data that Verra will be using for its allocations. They are for demonstrative purposes only. Now, they're real data, but they are not the actual activity data or forest cover benchmarks. They are proxy data. The bare data that you will need to use VT7 to develop a benchmark map of allocated risk boils down to 3 maps, from which you will develop other maps, but you really only need 3 maps to start. First, you'll need a binary mask of the jurisdiction to identify the area of interest. That's fairly straightforward. Second, you will need a map of administrative divisions, one level below the jurisdiction, rasterized onto the same grid as your mask and the forest cover benchmark maps. So basically, all that we're asking you to do here is to rasterize something like the ID associated with a given polygon in a administrative division shapefile and burn those values into your mask grid or FCBM grid. And then finally, you will need an 8-class forest cover benchmark map as described in VMD 55. If you're looking to replicate this on your own, you can use publicly available binary non-forest forest maps, such as those from Map Biomass or GFW or Tropical Moist Forests, and you can use that to create your own FCBMs. And the 8-class FCBM, I'm not going to go into too much depth here, but it just details the possible land cover transitions over 3 periods, over the start, midpoint of the historical reference period and the endpoint of the historical reference period. The importance of the midpoint will become apparent in the next slide. However, the midpoint is actually not necessarily used when we are developing our activity data. And ultimately, you will just use the 8-class FCBM to create additional binary maps, and the procedures for creating them and grouping the FCBM indices into binary maps are included with the VT7 documentation. I won't go into too much depth here, but basically you are going to group them into deforestation over certain time periods, stable forest and non-forest, and relevant information for during a given time period. Finally, from those binary maps of non-forest, you also need to develop your variable that we use for benchmark risk mapping, which is the distance to forest edge. And this is relatively easily done in a GIS or using a tool like GDAL proximity. But we are just looking for the distance from forest edge expressed in terms of whatever linear unit might be relevant to your equal area projection. The ultimate purpose of VT7 is prediction and selection of a suitable jurisdictional risk map. To make sure that we're adequately testing our maps to determine which one is the most appropriate for use as a final map, we break the risk map development sequence into 2 stages, and within the 2 stages, 2 phases. And apologies if this does get a little confusing. We say stages, we say phases, we say periods. It's very difficult to say a period in time in so many different ways and have it mean different things. But rest assured, they do. And the different stages and the different phases have different purposes within the risk map development sequence. The testing stage is primarily used for model evaluation and selection. So during the testing stage, if you look at the bottom component of this graphic, you will see that we have multiple periods. We have the calibration period and we have the confirmation period. So during the testing stage, we break the historical reference period into these 2 periods. Data from the calibration period is used to fit the model, and data from the confirmation period serves as a sort of out-of-sample validation set by which we can compare to the observed deforestation during the confirmation period. So for the testing stage, we fit the model with distance to forest edge at the start of the historical reference period, and we develop the relationship between map deforestation from the start of the project period to the midpoint, right? So we have distance to forest edge, and we have distance to forest edge at the start of the calibration period, and then we develop the relationship using the deforestation that occurred from the calibration period, within the calibration period, from the start to the midpoint. We then use the fitted model to predict deforestation from the midpoint to the end of the historical reference period, which is to the end of the confirmation period in this case. And we use the distance to forest edge at the midpoint as the single predictor variable instead of using it from the calibration period. We can then evaluate the quality of the predictions using the map deforestation data from the midpoint to the endpoint, right? So that's sort of our out of sample validation set, as I noted. The application stage is basically putting the map into production after it's been selected using the testing stage. So we fit a new model with data spanning the entirety of the historical reference period instead of just the calibration period. So kind of to put it in another way, we do replicate the process, but during the application stage, the historical reference period becomes the calibration period. And then we are actually using it for predictions and predicting into the future. We don't have any of that actual deforestation data to compare against. So yeah, it does represent the actual predictions that will be used for allocations during the baseline validity period. So I've referenced our benchmark map quite a bit, and I know many of you are already familiar with it, but our benchmark map is meant to act as a simple yet powerful and easily understood point of comparison by which we can evaluate more complex models to see how much of an improvement they offer beyond the benchmark. It acts as a threshold of quality in the absence of really well-known definitions of good in this context. I know, one of the concerns that has sometimes been raised is that we don't actually have any accuracy floors that need to be met. However, we do feel that this using the benchmark to serve as a threshold is a defensible choice, given that we don't actually have all that much in the way of well understood thresholds for that quality that we would be seeking to hit, especially for certain areas of interest. So rather than use sort of just common practice or rules of thumb, we've opted to, at the very least, use this benchmark for direct comparison. And are there going to be certain jurisdictions where the benchmark maps are more or less effective? Almost certainly. However, if you'll think back to the design principles I went through with you already of simplicity and parsimony, distance to forest edge used in this manner is somewhat of an obvious choice. The reason we've selected distance to forest edge as the single variable for our benchmark risk map is because, as you can see from the histograms above, the vast majority of deforestation occurs near the forest edge, and the amount of deforestation really decays rapidly the farther away you get from the forest edge. And this isn't something that just we came up with while we were developing VT7. There have been quite a few other studies that have had similar findings, and in another project that's doing forest risk maps at scale, the Forest at Risk project has found a similar finding that distance to forest edge is oftentimes the single most important predictor for modeling forest loss or predicting forest loss. And it's been, same thing's been found in multiple research papers. And actually, I think there was a global study done that found that I think something like 77% of global deforestation happens within 100 meters of existing forest edge. So again, going back to our design principles, we also wanted to identify areas where deforestation risk is negligible. So if you look at our histogram on the right, we developed what we call the negligible risk threshold, which I went through in the definitions. But the NRT is basically a distance at which we no longer are observing appreciable amounts of deforestation, and thus we think that the risk of deforestation at that distance is negligible. And as you can see from that plot on the right, the cumulative percentage of deforestation at really at distances beyond around 700 meters really starts to plateau. And at 2,175 meters, we have 99.5% of the deforestation occurring. So we take we use this NRT to create the first of our vulnerability classes, our ordinal vulnerability classes, and we assign distances beyond this threshold to our lowest vulnerability category. After we've calculated the NRT, we can convert our deforest risk maps. Again, this time, the single variable used to model deforestation risk being the distance to forest edge. We can take that and map it onto our ordinal vulnerability maps. And we do this pretty simply. We use a geometric classification where the highest risk classes are closest to forest edge and the lowest classes are the furthest, again, ranging from 0 to 30. And this is what a vulnerability map ends up looking like. And you can see on the left, if we zoom in, we can see the vulnerability categories, and we can see that they increase with distance from the black points there. And you can also see due to the geometric classification that the highest risk classes have fairly narrow distance bands to classify them, and those distance bands expand the lower risk classes that you have. So we see that the red pixels are very narrow and kind of constrained around those black areas, but they get wider and wider out as we go. And then the next step is to create the modeling regions map that we use to calculate the relative frequency of deforestation within the vulnerability classes per administrative region. So we use the administrative region one level below the jurisdiction to regionalize our estimates even further. The modeling regions, I know when I first came across this were a wee bit confusing, but they really just boil down to a pretty simple intersection of the vulnerability class against the modeling region. So if you look at the map on the right, you can see the modeling region 30144. That would correspond to a pixel with a vulnerability class of 30 within administrative region ID 144. And then we use these modeling regions to calculate the relative frequencies of deforestation. So for each modeling region, there'll be an associated frequency of deforestation. Given that the deforestation is a binary variable, the relative frequency is effectively a zonal mean of each modeling region serving as a zone. And then since this is a prediction, these relative frequencies are functionally probabilities. After you've calculated the relative frequencies for the fitting phase with the data from the calibration period, you can get started with prediction within the confirmation period. And again, this is all, I'm sorry, I need to maybe take a step back. This is all for the testing stage. I find it's a little bit easier to just go through the testing stage, and we'll talk about model evaluation, and then at the end we can talk about how this might be put into practice during the application stage. So to do this, you take your vulnerability map and your associated modeling region map for your confirmation period, and you replicate the process to create the modeling regions that we did for the calibration period. So you'll do the classification of the distance to forest edge at the midpoint. You'll put that into the ordinal vulnerability categories, and then you will do that intersection with the one level down administrative regions to create your modeling regions. Then you'll take the associated probabilities or the relative frequencies developed for the modeling regions in the calibration period, and you'll assign those probabilities to the corresponding pixels in the modeling regions, right? So you would take, for the calibration period, if you had a modeling region ID of 30144 and a relative frequency of 0.31, you would get all modeling regions in the confirmation period would have a relative, and that were within modeling region 30144 as well, would have a relative frequency of somewhere around 0.31. Finally, and really then you will have the relative frequency within the confirmation period. It really is that simple. It's just like a reclass by table operation. And then finally, to get the deforestation density per pixel, we divide those probabilities by the aerial resolution of the pixel. So for a Landsat pixel, 30 meters aside, we'd multiply by 0.09, and then we could express the deforestation densities in hectares per pixel. So acknowledging that that was a lot to take in, I'd like to summarize and then maybe talk a little bit more about using it during the application stage. So what we first do is we create prediction vulnerability maps and modeling region maps. To create the prediction vulnerability maps, we do the geometric classification of the distance to forest edge at a given time period, and then we merge that with the administrative maps one level down to create the modeling regions. Then for the calibration period, we calculate the relative frequencies of deforestation within those modeling regions. After that, using the modeling regions maps for the confirmation period, we assign relative frequencies to those. And to do that, for the application stage, you would basically just be using the same general process. However, you would be using the entirety of the historical reference period to develop for your covariates instead of breaking it into the confirmation and calibration periods. And the prediction would then, as I said earlier, extend into the baseline validity period. One note that I haven't quite hit on, though, is that we do try to be area preserving for the observed deforestation. So we do a quantity adjustment for the testing stage where we don't have activity data for that midpoint. We adjust the prediction quantity just to match the observed deforestation as counted by the pixels in the maps. However, during the application stage, when we do have activity data at the end of the historical reference period, we can adjust the quantity of deforestation predicted by the risk mapping process to make sure that it doesn't exceed the amount of deforestation that we estimated during our activity data collection process via visual interpretation. So we do this quantity adjustment and we make everything into densities, and it ultimately yields a map of allocated risk where each pixel is scaled to match the estimated deforestation from activity data sampling. Again, this is for the application stage, not necessarily for the testing stage. And again, I think that's honestly a little bit clearer and easier to go into depth on in the VT7 documentation. But if anybody has any questions on that, I'm happy to take those on. I'm going to keep hammering this in, but the benchmark is meant to serve as a benchmark, and the intent is to actually use alternative models to develop our jurisdictional risk maps. And please take this to heart. I know there have been some concerns noted over the simplicity of the benchmark risk mapping process, and that perhaps distance to forest edge alone isn't good enough to do this type of modeling in complex environments. And this is to say, we hear you, and we don't necessarily intend to use distance to forest edge to do just that. So again, please take this to heart that the benchmark method is a standard against which alternative deforestation risk models may be compared. At least 2 alternative models must be tested with the goal of developing a more skillful model. However, an alternative model must pass 2 tests as described in the coming slides before being accepted for use. So I have this in big bold letters, and please take this with you if you take anything from this presentation. What do I mean when I say alternative risk maps? Basically, I mean better maps created with variables beyond only distance to forest edge, and the potential use of more complex modeling methods. So while we acknowledge that distance to forest edge is an important predictor, and as far as an individual predictor, it's very good. We expect that multivariate models, including covariates such as distance to roads, protected areas, slope, population density, etc., will yield better results than distance to forest edge alone. Please note, again, these are just example covariates, and there are standards and quality constraints for supplementary data to be considered during developing alternative risk maps. But the limitations on what actually constitutes an eligible covariate is fairly minimal. And I should also note that for the time being, we're allowing for alternative risk maps, but the alternative risk maps must then be classified to those ordinal vulnerability maps that I had referenced before. This is something that we're going to continue evaluating and keeping an eye on the impact of this. But think of the probability map created from the alternative models as a one-to-one replacement for the distance to forest edge maps in the modeling process. Everything else with the modeling regions and the relative frequency and all of that is repeated. And the reason we did this, and we have tested with using just the actual direct predictions, but we found that by using it in this way, we actually got stronger predictions. Although we are always, as I said, in the spirit of continuous improvement, happy to be proved wrong. So we've went through developing benchmark maps. We touched on developing alternative maps. And at the end of it, we've got a bunch of maps. We've got alternatives, at least 2. We've got benchmarks. So how do we pick which ones we ultimately use? Well, it comes down to really a handful of pretty simple tests. And to start with the testing, we create a coarse grid. The cell size of the coarse grid can be modified in the VT7 tool, but our going rule of thumb is that the cell sizes should be approximately equivalent to the median size of a RED project in the jurisdiction. And then what we do is using that grid, we sum the observed deforestation for a given period in each grid cell. And again, observed meaning calculated from the deforestation, the deforestation maps derived from the forest cover benchmark maps. So we sum the observed deforestation for a given period in each cell, and then we sum the predicted deforestation within a given grid cell. Then using those 2 values, we calculate the median absolute error for both the calibration period and the confirmation period. The final model that we ultimately select should have the lowest median absolute error for both the confirmation period and the calibration period. And the alternative model must outperform both the results from the calibration and confirmation period to be considered. Again, the Python version of VT7 does all of this calculation for you, and it actually spits out these really lovely plots that you can see on the right, and ultimately, you know, this makes model selection far easier than having to do all of this yourself. Yeah, again, thinking back to our key design principles, you know, we wanted model selection to be somewhat straightforward, and we think we've at the very least put together a straightforward and defensible process for this. And you know, again, there are going to be learnings along the way, but we've done a lot of research to support these conclusions that we've come to, and we're confident that at the very least this will lead to strong risk maps. And so there you have it. After selecting a model in the testing stage, you move on to the application stage and you effectively replicate the process, but you just change your covariates to, as I said, extend the length of the historical reference period instead of being just tied to those calibration or confirmation periods. And you use that to predict across the baseline validity period. And then you've got your estimated per pixel deforestation risk for the 6-year baseline validity period directly following your historical reference period. And that's really the long and short of VT7 and the processes and the technical components of it. You know, again, I'd encourage you guys to please read through the documentation, but also please play around with the Python version of the tool. It's pretty easy to use. There's a GUI. We are again looking to improve our some of our cross-platform support. For now, it is very Windows friendly and not so friendly to other operating systems, but we are looking to make changes there. And it's a graphical tool, so you don't even need to know Python or anything like that. But if you do want to use Python, we are looking to put together a Python API so we can deploy this more effectively, acknowledging that a lot of users would rather do it that way and be able to deploy it on EC2 instances and similar. So moving to roles and responsibilities, I'm going to go through this relatively quickly, but this is just to say Verra is responsible for doing the bulk of this work, okay? And I said it at the beginning, but the project proponent is not necessarily expected to use VT7 hardly at all. We will be developing the benchmark risk maps. We will be developing the alternative risk maps through our partnerships with our data service providers. We've made the tool and accompanying software publicly available so that we can get eyes on it and have people suggest, you know, in the spirit of continuous improvement. But ultimately, it is for Verra use and use by Verra's contractors. That said, stakeholders do have the opportunity to be involved with the risk mapping development process in the way of submitting materials that we have outlined the submission requirements for in VMD 55. And on that note, we have an open call for supplementary materials for the first round of risk maps that we're producing that is set to close at the end of this week. So please, if you do have any materials that you'd like to submit for our phase 1 jurisdictions, please get them in ASAP. And yeah, again, I have one more slide to kind of maybe just drive this home visually, and then we'll go through next steps and I'll hopefully be able to go through some questions. But as you can see on this, there's a lot of purple and a lot of red, which is steps done by Verra and steps done by Verra's independent third-party consultants that we're going to be using for review of our data. So really, we do everything up until the end where we will deliver an allocated risk map to the project proponents, and then they will use that to develop their baseline emissions using their project-specific emissions factors. So really, none of this, a lot of this is going to happen well before the project proponent even necessarily needs to get involved. Not saying we don't welcome their involvement by submitting supplementary materials. And with that, next steps for Verra. We are doing the work and we're developing risk maps for our phase 1 jurisdictions. We've already started doing that work, and we'll be putting together a bit more in the way of an announcement, hopefully sometime today or tomorrow. In addition, as I said, we've got that open call for supplementary materials, and please get your stuff in. And then in the course of using the tool and to create the risk maps, we're going to continue to make improvements to our software to make it more scalable and cross-platform friendly. Right now, it's very memory hungry, and we're going to be looking for ways to parallelize wherever we can or use distributed computing. And we're going to keep looking for edge cases and enhancements to the approach itself. This is a V1.0, but we want to make sure that we remain dynamic and action valuable feedback and findings accordingly. So with that, I am at the end, and I welcome some questions for the last 10 or so minutes.
Great. Andrew, thank you so much for that fantastic overview of the tool. So I've been looking at the questions in the background. Thank you for everybody submitting those. So we have a couple questions that relate to availability of the information. So can you speak, Andrew, to what of this in terms of the maps and allocation information is going to be made public?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's a great point. And I think that's still on some level being discussed at Verra, but we do want to make as much of this publicly available as possible. The forest cover benchmark maps, as well as the risk maps. Our current thinking is that we will make this publicly available on our website for download per jurisdiction, and then kind of recoup our costs for developing this data at the time of allocation. That's to say, this is somewhat speculative, but I am very much in favor of radical transparency here, and I would like to make this as free and publicly available as possible, and that's what I'm pushing for. But Naomi, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but we're still kind of discussing that a little bit.
Yeah, we're figuring out final policy. Our intent is to produce as much of this freely available as possible. However, we do need to recoup the cost of the investment in gathering the data, undertaking this risk mapping process, et cetera. So there are a number of other questions around the fees. So we will be posting the fee schedule very, very soon. We're just adjusting that based on the final costs that we're incurring for this next round of data to make sure that we're able to recover those costs. But that is all we're trying to do with this. This is not intended as any kind of additional revenue to Verra above and beyond what it has cost us to actually implement. So we're just doing final numbers on that, and then we will have out the fee schedule. And the idea for that is that the fees will be charged when the data allocation request is made as part of the official process. We may have an option for getting data earlier, figuring out exactly what that will look like and optionality there. And then this is also intended at the moment to be based on the size of the project. So obviously we have a different range of costs associated with different countries, and different countries have a different number of projects. So we're not trying to directly recoup this country by country, rather at a whole portfolio level. So the fee will be standard for any project based on the size in hectares of the project. So anyway, we will be posting the final numbers soon. Our intent is just to recover the cost, and our intent is hopefully this ends up being less than many people have been paying for this kind of data in the process of gathering it for their individual projects historically.
Great. I'm trying to go through some of these questions now, and I'll do some of the quick and dirty ones. Confirm the number of years for each period. The historical reference period is a 10-year period before the baseline validity period, which is a 6-year period. We do have some flexibility, I think, of plus or minus 365 days around those periods based on imagery availability. And
another interesting one, Andrew, about projects that cross subnational jurisdictions. Can you talk a little bit more about national versus subnational and how a project might be allocated their information if they are across a couple of jurisdictions?
Yeah, so I'm trying to think of the way this is worded in VMD 55, but basically, if the project, you basically would do the allocation for the constituent portions of the project that fall within a given jurisdiction, right? So if you are split across two, you develop the allocated risk maps for the first of the jurisdictions, and then you would do it for the second of the jurisdictions. We do have like buffers for subnational jurisdictions of 10 kilometers to make sure that we are minimizing the edge effects. But you would have your allocations be only derived from the jurisdiction from which the activity data was calculated. And then again, you would not be using the buffer areas in those calculations. So it's additive across the jurisdictions. Now, we have, I think, only 2 countries right now where we've got subnational projects or subnational jurisdictions, which is Brazil and DRC. And we haven't, to be blunt, we haven't done the allocations for those yet. But that is how it's meant to function.
Thanks. There's another one here around for the same jurisdiction, are all projects required to use the same model, either benchmark or alternative, or is it on a project by project case within the jurisdiction? So
yeah,
you can do.
So yeah, it's important. Like the model here ultimately becomes adopted for the entirety of the jurisdiction. So if your project occurs within the jurisdiction, there is no project-specific risk modeling that happens. This will all be done at the level of the jurisdiction, and then the allocation will be done at the project level. Basically, you will clip out the portion of the jurisdictional risk map that contains your project area and your leakage belt, and do your emissions, and your baseline calculations on that using that allocated, using that subcomponent of the jurisdictional risk map. So no, there is one risk map that is adopted for the entirety of a jurisdiction for the baseline validity period. There will not be project-specific risk maps. Can project proponents propose alternative models? That's a good question. The way that VMD55 is worded right now, yes, they are able to do so. That said, those will need to be basically tested against and verified by our data service providers, who are ultimately responsible for selecting the final risk map. But yes, we do make provisions for that. We do need a good bit in the way of description and documentation on the data and everything used to develop the risk maps, but we do currently allow for that per VMD 55.
There's another one around how things change over time. So the benchmark is looking at the distance to forest edge, but obviously in reality that edge will move over time. So how do we account for sort of changes over time in this process?
So we are updating the distance to forest edge at whatever given time we are doing those estimations for. I think I saw this question, and I'm not quite sure. This would be a really interesting one to discuss more offline, as I really want to get to the heart of it, and it might be easier to do in discussion. But we are moving, basically we're not just saying from period 1, this is the distance to forest edge, and just use that. We do, when we do the fitting with the distance from one period, and then we do the application with the distance to forest edge at the next phase. So we fit with, let's say time period 1, then we update distance to forest edge from time period 2, and the predictions are run with that versus the first one that it was fit on. But I think I'm misunderstanding the question, and it'd be good to talk through it. So we'll log that one.
There's one that also I'm not entirely following, but just to highlight it, around the grid cell size, and sort of at what scale are we analyzing this, sort of the size of a red project, or we predict with smaller pixels and then sum it up to a coarse value across a project?
Yeah, so it's the latter. We have these grid cells that are basically the size of a red project. Now you can calculate the grid cells at whatever size you want. It's an input that you make to the VT7 Python tool. And basically our findings are unsurprising that at smaller scales or smaller grid cell sizes, you have more variance, and then at larger grid cell sizes, you have less variance, as kind of things tend to wash out at scale. I think the most important thing for us is to make sure that the grid cell size remains consistent across everything that you are doing your evaluations of. Again, because this is ultimately to be used for model selection, so we need to remain consistent there. But for now, our guidance, as said, is to basically sum the pixels within a grid cell roughly the size of a median-sized RED project in the jurisdiction.
Great. There's another question that I think is a good one about other activities. So this one relates to whether or not this is usable for the new wetlands methodology. So at the moment, no, the wetlands methodology VM33 is being updated. And the approach that works in this case is because we're looking at unplanned deforestation across the whole jurisdiction, where this type of modeling can sort of predict where things are likely to occur based on risk. Whereas in many cases, the challenge with wetlands is that for a specific type of wetland, they're often more constrained in terms of geographical distribution, or fairly limited in terms of where they exist. For example, if you're thinking about mangroves in many countries, there's not a whole lot left, or they're very limited in terms of their extent within a country. So this kind of an allocation approach may not work in the context of wetlands. So have a look at more directly the blue carbon and wetlands methodology information that's on our website. And if there's more specific questions on it, you can send them to forestcarbon@verra.org, and we'll get those answered by our wetlands experts.
Great. I do appreciate all of these questions, and I've got what appears to be a somewhat manageable level of questions. So if you are not an anonymous attendee, I will try to respond to your questions in an email following this. I can't make any promises that will be prompt, but I will try to do it as I have availability. I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time out of their day. I know it's very early or very late for some of you, so thank you for taking the time. I hope it was worth it. If you have any additional questions that you didn't get a chance to ask in the QA, please write them up to forestcarbon@verra.org. And with that, I bid you adieu.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.